Hello and welcome. This will be a sort of demo lesson tutorial for how variables work in the Peoplesoft Test Framework tool. Variables are important tools in programming and in PTF. They can store different types of values such as numbers, strings, characters, and dates. You can also have your test pull information off the page and store those in variables for use later. In our examples, we're going to be using the step type message box and the action OK only. What this does, it just brings up a little message box with an OK button in the middle. When you click OK, it'll close the message box. In the parameters column, we're going to have a prompt. In this case, it's hello world. I think that's a good way to start a programming example. We're going to hit run. And here we go. It brings up a PTF message box, printing the prompt we put, hello world. We can see the steps that it took in the log on the left. I like to use message boxes for testing my variables, testing different functions I might not have used before. They're not something I typically use in my actual tests, though. In our second example, instead of having hello world as the prompt, instead we're going to have hello and then the variable name. In the first step of the test, we're going to be using the step type variable and the action set value. And we're going to be setting the variable name to name. And in PTF, all variables have to come after an ampersand character, otherwise they won't be recognized as a variable. And we're going to be setting this variable to the string world. Give this one a run. And here we go, it brings up the same message box, hello world. We can see in the log steps, the first step here is setting the variable name to world. And the prompt here, which was hello and then the variable name name, is printed as hello world. Next, we're going to look at two tests. One of them is called hello world set name. All this one's doing is setting that variable to world. So when we give this one a run, there won't be a message box that pops up. But we can see in the log that the variable name was set to world. And then we have this one, hello world read name. When we run this one, it's going to print out the prompt on the message box, hello, and then the variable name. But we'll see that that doesn't really work because in this test, the variable name was never set. All right, so how do we get around that? How do we get it so that one test can use a variable that was set in another test? Now, the way we do that is to use a shell test. This shell test is going to call the last two tests we looked at in the order we looked at them. So it's going to call the test first that sets the variable to world, and then this one is the one that will read it and display that message box. All right, and there we see the PTF message box displayed the prompt that we expected it to. And looking at the log, we can see that it first called the hello world set name test, where in this step it is setting the name variable to world. Then it called the hello world read name test, and there it's displaying the message box. So as we saw, variables can be used between tests, provided that they're both called within the same test. But at the end of it, those variables and their values will go away. Now we can do the same thing, but in the first line, instead of calling the set name test, we'll just set the variable to world there. And in a shell test, you have far fewer options for the step type, but one of them is to set a variable. And here we got the same result, but with one less test call there. Next, we're going to look at another type of variable. These are called parameters. You can see that a parameter is a little different than a regular variable. It doesn't start with an ampersand. It starts with a percent, and then the word param, dot, then the variable name, or the parameter name, and then close it off with a percent. And we're going to declare this a little differently. The name is chosen up here in this little broom icon, the test properties box. And here we have name as our one parameter for this. This is also a library test. We indicate it's a library test by checking this box here. You can have multiple parameters. Another thing about a library test is that you can't run it on its own. This green button up here that we've been using to run our tests is not available. So what you need to do is call it from another test. When calling a library test that uses parameters, you're going to set those parameters here in this parameters column here. When we were using shell tests before, we were leaving this parameters column blank when calling other tests. But here we are setting that parameter name. So that comes first, and we're setting it equal to the string world. So running this, there's our PTF message box, and it's outputting what we intended. You can also set parameters using variables. Here we're setting that name parameter to the name variable, and they can be the same name. See, the parameter is the same name as the variable there, ampersand name. So running this won't actually work, because remember, we haven't set the variable name anywhere in that shell yet. First, we have to run that test that sets the variable name there. And remember, we're setting it to the string world. So then in this parameters column here, we're really setting that name parameter again to be world, because that's what's stored in the name variable there. And there we go. And we can look at the log. In the first test we ran, the hello world set name test, you can see the variable name being set. Now we're going to talk about persistent variables. As we saw before, this message box will just display hello and then the variable name here. And that's because it's not being set anywhere else. Well, how can we get variables to be used between tests that aren't being called all in a sequence? And the way to do that is persistent variables. Here we have this test that is going to write its variable to a persistent variable, and we determine that by going back to this test properties icon, this broom, and choosing variable action up here as write. So when we run this one, here we have set the variable name to Jess, the string Jess, and it says we've saved that as a persistent variable. So now if we go back into that test properties area, in this test, which is meant to read that variable we just saved, we see we have variable action here set to read. Normally in the previous test, we've had it set to none. And there we have it. It outputs hello Jess. You can see in the log here, it's reading that persistent variable, which we just saved in the last test we ran. And it was able to do this even though the only difference between the two of these tests, this one on the left that did not work the first time, the only difference here is that the variable action is different. To make that other test work, all we have to do is go in and change the variable action to read. It's going to be able to read that persistent variable that we set in the right test. There we have it. It's read the persistent variables and it outputs what was stored in that variable.